going to hear next from Dr. Jane Waters from Trinity St David, and she's going to talk to us about shifting sands, negotiating professional roles and responsibilities during a period of culture change. So the Shifting Sands research project seeks to capture the understandings of those involved in ITE, based in the higher education institutions and in partnership schools of one of the providers, about the expectations, roles and responsibilities that are inherent in the process of change currently being experienced in the sector. So the project seeks to make visible the processes and experiences of change, to guide the support that's offered to those enacting the changes, and also to contribute to the understanding of and theorising about systems of professional learning through a period of what might be seen as enforced professional identity change. So big questions. Look forward to hearing the answers. So thanks, Jane.
Okay, thank you, It's really wonderful to be here and to be invited to talk about this subject. I think we've heard Nigel and Jeremy talk about processes of change. And this project, we've also heard Graham talk about honesty and reflection. And I think what this project seeks to do is to try and ask questions about the process of change that we're currently involved in within a huge system of change within Wales. And it kind of asks some uncomfortable questions and raises some possibly uncomfortable issues at some points in this process. So I'm always used to using these things. All right. So we're all aware of the context of change here in relation to ITE, and we understand that this sits within the context of systemic change within a national education system that's concerned to ensure that the curriculum is moving from transmitting established bodies of knowledge to ensuring that every learner grows as capable, healthy, well-rounded, an individual who can thrive in the face of unknown future challenges. Within that change, the role of the teacher-educator has a number of associated identities, from school teacher, teacher of teachers and researchers, but there is evidence within a wider system that those involved in ITE may have previously lacked a coherent professional identity. The drive for reform in Wales directly addresses the roles and responsibilities of teacher-educators, be they situated in HEIs or be they situated in schools. And within the accreditation process for programmes of ITE, there's the explicit expectation for partnership working and shared responsibility between university-based and school-based staff. Accordingly, we know that some HEIs in Wales have seen changes to their staffing structures within education units, both within the HEI and within schools associated with ITE provision. In the HEI involved in this study, there was also an institutional restructuring process that sat outside of those changes within ITE, but was coincidental in terms of timing. So this project sits within this process of change and seeks to understand it. The Shifting Sands project seeks to explore the perceptions of those involved in the change process, both within the HEI and within the partnership schools. And we wanted, as has been already said, to make visible these processes and experiences in order to guide the support offered to those enacting the changes and to contribute to the understanding of and theorising about systems of professional learning through a period of what might be seen as enforced identity change. And while this is situated within the structures of ITE, I wonder if there is possible learning and implications for what we're asking of our school-based staff as they enact a very new and very different curriculum. And we've heard already about the notion of the challenge of shifting mindset. So I think this may have there may be some points of reflection in regard to that. So our work was framed by two questions. What are the perceptions and experiences of staff working in ITE about their professional roles and responsibilities during a period of culture change? And how are the changes in professional roles and responsibilities negotiated? So it's important to note that the intention was to gain an understanding of the individual's perceptions and experiences within a collective change process. This is in recognition that teacher educators are not a homogeneous group, but have individual agency and will experience change and impact change differently. So the methodology, to check I've got the right slide, We collected data via self-chosen focus groups using external facilitators to ensure confidentiality and to encourage open and honest discussion. So we employed 2 experienced facilitators who were OECD trained in facilitation. They were external to the university and to its partnership, and indeed they were from across the border, so external to the Welsh context, though familiar with work in ITE, so understood the context and the arena in which they were working. They worked with the focus groups using predetermined key questions that were provided by the researchers that focused around those research questions. The first data collection event took place during the process of ITE accreditation, and that was with the HEI staff. And the second data collection event took place with school-based staff just after the award of the accreditation to the partnership. So I think that those 2 contextual timely positionings are quite important. There will be 2 further sets of data collection this academic year during the first year of implementation of the newly accredited programmes. So the facilitators used what we were describing as a deliberately visual scripting method to enable the group members to see the points being recorded and to add to them as they wished during the discussion. So this method was chosen to build trust and to enable transparent and mutually agreed and shared ownership of the data, but also to ensure that individual voices within those groups could be heard and reported confidentially and in due course anonymously to us as researchers. The offer was also made to participants to submit further points by email, though no additional material was forthcoming after focus groups. The responses were then anonymised and transcribed by the facilitators, who then provided a report to us as researchers. So the report includes both the agreed shared responses from the focus groups, scripted by the facilitators in full view and agreement of those in the focus groups, and also includes the direct quotes from individuals who had spoken or written these comments during the focus groups and had added them to the collective message that was being put forward. So that's the data, the methodology. In terms of our literature review, we reviewed literature pertaining to the following 3 arenas: the context of change in the field of teacher education, material related to teacher-educator identity, and culture change within organisations. So we recognise that in this context, the initiators of change included social change within wider society, the call for 21st century skills for pupil outcomes, and also a standards agenda related to perceptions of weakness within what was then current IT provision, the change within teachers' work and identity related to new curriculum requirements and new ways of understanding curriculum, and the changing responsibility of teacher educators, for example, embedded within the new models of partnership. We were interested in how these change factors conflated in the experience of the individuals involved in these change processes. In terms of the teacher-educator literature, teacher educators have been described as having a number of identities, and these aren't necessarily fixed but can fluctuate. So the teacher educators can be teachers, they can be teachers of teachers, they can be researchers, they can be inquiry partners, and they can be learners. We also reviewed literature pertaining to negotiating organisational culture change, which is effectively the context in which we're working. And we recognise there are interacting elements of cultural change within an organisation or institution, and these have been described as organisational becoming. So organisations in this sense are not seen as fixed entities. So the HEI and the school and the context in which we're working is not a fixed entity, but an unfolding enactment in which change occurs in the everyday interactions as actors engage in the process of establishing new meanings. And that was very important to us as we took this analysis forward, this notion that change occurs in the everyday interactions of the actors involved. That's how we enact change. So we note that the change was not within a static organisation. There are changes and challenges within the HEI sector that sit outside of the changes and challenges within education. So the HEI sector itself is an unfolding happening. And equally, schools are experiencing dramatic experience of change with curriculum, so they are equally unfolding happenings. So the theoretical frames that we considered in approaching this study, we recognise that not only do we want to explore individuals' perceptions of changes in their roles and responsibilities, but this is taking place amidst an environment of considerable and sustained culture change. So the study exists within a socio-cultural paradigm, and our framework needs to assist us in analysis of our data with regard to these multifaceted aspects of change across the system in which our participants are also experiencing both individual and collective change. We looked at Lewin's three-step models of change, but that's contingent upon a return to stability. So Lewin talked about change as being a period of instability and 3 steps, and then you return to a period of stability, allowing a reformation of group dynamics. But because the environment in which this research is taking place does not have that required return to stability, because we're all involved in ongoing change, Lewin's work in field theory and group dynamics had limitations for us theoretically. So we turned then to cultural historical activity theory or chat theory, and it offers a model of understanding activity in systems undergoing change. This model allows us to explore change and relationships between aspects of that change that exist at micro, meso and macro levels. However, while the use of chat supports analysis of the influence of individuals on the change taking place and the context of change, it's limited when we try to understand how those individuals are negotiating that change. And for us, the agentic element of the experience was fundamental in our inquiry. So we looked at the work of Emma Beyer-Amish, and this provides a mechanism for understanding individual action within a system. The model describes agency as falling within 3 dimensions, called the caudal triad of agency. Combining these 2 constructs, then, we felt would allow us to gain a deeper and richer understanding of individuals' perceptions of and experiences of change within a system that was itself undergoing culture change. So we needed a theoretical framework which allows us to gain an understanding of not only the impact of change on individual perspectives, but also how individual perspectives may shape the change, whilst acknowledging that there are likely to be external forces over which those individuals have no control. So the analytical process then, we started with examining the data for recurring themes, which were then coded against the agentic dimensions of the caudal triad of agency. Our premise was that by identifying the agency of participants in the change process and analysing the agentic dimensions at work, we'd gain a deeper understanding of the perceptions and experiences of individuals within the system undergoing many collective changes. So Emma Beyer-Amish argue that the agentic dimension lies in how actors selectively recognise, understand and respond in their ongoing situated transactions. So if we go back to understanding changing cultures as those everyday interactions between actors, this allows us to understand what is driving those everyday interactions for those people experiencing change. And the model describes these 3 agentic dimensions. Iterative is where the individual's choice and action is based on past experience through patterns and action. Their initial reaction to change or to a new situation is based on their experience and related to habit. The projective agentic dimension involves the imagination process of individuals in what is to come. And what is visible in responses is these future actions or future pathways, and we see hopes and fears and desires for the future in the projective element of agency. And then there's the practical evaluative element, where we see individuals' ability to make practical and normative decisions based on the different courses of action that are available. So these are in response to current demands and dilemmas, the ambiguities of time, and these responses are situated firmly in the present. So there's a whole load of words that I've used there, and I'm hoping they'll make more sense as I move into the data. But it's important to have this kind of background in terms of the work we're trying to do and what we're trying to contribute to the field, in effect. So I'm presenting some of our data and our early analysis, bearing in mind we've just had 2 rounds of data collection and there are 2 more to be undertaken this year. So here is this a pointy thing? So here we have the changes that have occurred for staff within the HEIs. And we've got some, I'm not going to read these out, you can read those, I'm going to say something different. But these are examples of what was taken from the report and coded against these titles. So there's emphasis in the responses from those within the HEI on the changes in roles and responsibilities on a personal level. So when they were asked about changes in roles and responsibilities, they talked about themselves, the changes they'd experienced, and there was no reference to the role the change was having in order to create the equitable working partnership between HEI-based ITE and the corresponding school partnership. So the changes were reported as personal changes for those within the HEI. The iterative dimension was very apparent for these individuals. Their responses appeared located within current sets of structures and current demands of ITE. And bear in mind, these responses were given prior to the award of the programmes, the accreditation for new ITE programmes. When we compare this to the changes in roles and responsibilities reported by school-based staff, they were actually reporting fairly similar changes to those roles, but we see that the projective element is very apparent in individual responses. Responses were located in the future project, the creation of a new structure to support working in partnership. We get a sense of empowerment. We see here that the school staff are saying they no longer feel done to. They're working as true partners. They feel they have a voice. They've been enabled to make and impact on and influence change in this process. So this is in contrast to the kinds of indications of anxiety and possibly loss that some staff in the HEI were reporting. There's an indication that the school-based staff perception was of gaining from co-working and co-delivery. And this was quite different from the language in response to these questions from the HEI staff at the time. But we have to remember this data was collected after the award of the ITE accreditation, so there is a contextual difference there. When we explored the ways in which the roles and responsibilities had changed, we have this kind of summary list. We see that responses include now the notion of partnership working. So the changes have been involved in developing this working in partnership, but the responses are still focused on personal experience of change in individual roles. And these are kind of couched in what the structures of the past were. So the iterative dimension of agency is still dominant. Again, we're still with the HEI here. There is, in some of this data, we see the HEI staff explaining how they've experienced changes. We see some of the projective agentic elements here, exciting opportunities, the chance to develop new skills. So there was some of that future-focused projection going on. However, the individual experience of changes to roles and responsibilities is still couched heavily within experiences of the past. And you get the sense that the structures of the past feel comfortable, while the possible and as yet unclear structures of the future are not yet comfortable or are unfamiliar and strange. We have, in terms of the language used, we have this sense of anxiety here. There's been a void, and there's a lot of unknowns. So when we look at the way in which roles and responsibilities have changed in school, in response to this area of discussion, school-based staff didn't focus on their own personal experience of change. Their responses remained within the the projective agentic element. They're focused on the future with visible emphasis on the collaborative process. We see mention of co-working, co-construction, and co-delivery. One gets the sense that for this group there's no sense of loss for those pre-existing sets of cultural practices in ITE. Even though all of these schools have been heavily involved in ITE for many, many years, there's no sense of loss for that, for those past experiences. When looking at how how these changes have been negotiated within the HEI, the ways in which the HEI staff were negotiating these changes were understandably highly varied. And we can't think about any groups, particularly this group, as a homogeneous group, and this wide-ranging data reminds us of that. There were some perceptions that staff had been involved in the changes and that this change sat within a national context, but there was recognition of discomfort through this change process. Some staff were enthusiastic about the change, and others were resigned to it, and others felt it was a fait accompli. We see some of the projective elements of agency in these responses, and with some iterative elements remaining. However, all the elements of the called a triad of agency are evident in these responses, and it's here that we see the introduction of the practical evaluative elements. Individuals indicate practical, pragmatic decisions for action that are rooted very much in the present, in their present context. We get the sense that this group of staff feel we'll do the absolute best that we possibly can for the students, so then that moral purpose comes through in some of their responses. In terms of how these changes have been negotiated within school, there's a recognition by the school staff that the HEI staff have had to make significant adjustments to their ways of working in the past, and that they've done this well, but it may not have been easy. So the participants recognise support of the difficult decisions that have been made by the university. And it was suggested that for university tutors, the adjustment to new working practices may not have been so easy. Responses from school-based staff indicated a sense of involvement, commitment and enthusiasm, and recognition of the value of the time to work collaboratively and to think through issues. The agentic element most visible in the school responses remains that projective and future-focused response, and responses are embedded in a sense of evolution towards visionary change. Here, very few comments were located in the practical evaluative present. However, the need for effective communication as we move forward is highlighted, and also the recognition that we're in the infancy of this project. So we're starting to see in the school-based staff a sense of the practical evaluative location in the present. It's interesting that school-based staff talk about their being in the early stages and the infancy of this project. For the HEI staff, they had been involved in a period of change for about a year already, because the impact of the new changes for HEI staff had started much earlier in rethinking ways of working, developing partnerships. So there's a time lag in the implementation process for the different partners in this change process. HEI staff experiencing change about a year before school-based staff. So the way in which we're seeking to understand this data, the analysis to date has been restricted to the loose thematic grouping that you've seen of the responses and the application of the called a triad of agency. The analysis appears to indicate that many of the perceptions of participants in the HEI were derived from their past experiences, and that this response may be habitual in nature. Experiences of the past impact on perceptions of the present regarding the changes in roles and responsibilities. And furthermore, the participants held a number of different perspectives concurrently. Participants from schools generally held perceptions that were future-focused. They did not tend to locate responses in past experiences, though all these school staff have been involved in ITE provision for many years. Our conjecture then is that individual responses from those in HEIs can be understood to have been shaped by the pre-existing and cultural sets of structures that exist to frame their professional lives as teacher educators in the university. These structures, in the process of reaccreditation, have been removed or reshaped in this context of change, and it may be that those staff have experienced a sense of loss of their professional identity within that process of change. By contrast, those teacher educators in schools, who to date are more primarily teachers of children and may not necessarily have previously identified as teacher educators, they have cultural structures in their professional lives that have not yet had to change, or when this data was collected hadn't yet had to change. And their perceptions are that the changes will necessarily be positive and will enhance their professional roles, which won't be fundamentally altered. We also conjectured that the HEI staff had perhaps a stronger sense of what they may be losing i.e. they knew the past and didn't know what the future would look like, than the school staff had of what was being gained, because it was still quite visionary and amorphous in that sense. So in conclusion then, the analytical framework we require to respond to our research questions needs to be more than either Emma Beer and Mishi's causal triad of agency or Engstrom's activity triangle can offer in isolation. We believe that by first using the causal triad of agency to understand the agentic reactions taking place and then incorporating that understanding within the activity triangle will help us gain a richer insight into the context of change and the individual's perception of and responses to these changes. Also, the dynamics of change for individuals within groups are sitting within contexts that are also different and differently changing. So theoretically then, we suggest that bringing together these two constructs can help us understand how agency can shape and influence change as change shapes and influence agency. And that's really what we're trying to understand, is how individuals are experiencing and responding to change in a highly complex structure, really in order that those of us involved in leading those changes can do it better, can recognise the situation of change that we're demanding of professionals and how we might better support them through those changes. And in hearing the previous presenters, Nigel talked about the quality of support in a change process earlier, and I think this study may help us to understand how important that quality of support is in recognising when we're trying to move professionals from one place and way of thinking and one set of structures to another way of thinking and another set of structures. And we intend that this work will help us shed more of a light on understanding how we might do that better. So I've rattled through that really quickly. I've no idea what the time is. Bang on. Yes. So yes, happy to answer any questions. And I know I was reading, but it's because it's quite complex and I wanted to get all those points across. So I hope it didn't read too it wasn't too mechanical a presentation. But happy to take any questions or comments. Be delighted actually. God, silence.
Yeah, I've got one question. You know, the title for many of those slides was roles and responsibilities. Is that a title that you used when questioning the HEI, or is this something that came out of the research?
No, it was part of the key questions that were asked.
No, does that do you think actually direct them to actually looking at their roles and responsibilities rather than their practice? Because a lot of the responses, it seemed to me, were to do with I'm responsible for this and I'm responsible for this and I've got an additional responsibility here or less here, rather than actually looking fundamentally at how you actually educate teachers, because that seemed to be missing from their responses. And that was also true in Nigel's research, wasn't it? The teachers didn't talk about their own practice at all.
I think we explicitly were exploring how professionals who are being required to change their professional identity were negotiating that change. So we were exploring how they were experiencing the change in roles and responsibilities. And yes, they did focus just on that because that's what we asked them. We didn't ask them about their practice. But I think it's quite interesting that the teachers, arguably school-based staff, in this process of change within ITE, school-based staff have now have a shared responsibility and accountability for the outcomes of ITE partnerships. And yet we're in this study at this time, and I do think it would be interesting to look at the findings we get when we do the next two focus groups. There was no sense of kind of trepidation or anxiety about that. It was just this wonderful vision that was being put forward. And we shouldn't, from this data, take the sense that the HEI-based staff were not completely embedded and committed to the change. They really were. And we have a very wonderful, thriving partnership within the HEI. But it was trying to unpack how that change was being enacted and experienced. Really, because it's a new thing, isn't it? Globally, we're requiring education professionals to take on sometimes dramatically different identities with just a change in role or a tweak in kind of structure, and yet we don't necessarily understand how that change process is experienced by individuals. And in order to manage those change processes better, we need to understand individual change, because it is in those everyday individual actions that change is or is not taken forward successfully. So I don't know if that answered the question, but we didn't ask them about practice, no. That would probably be easier to say.
Not as interesting.
Yeah, thank you very much. For me, that was an important culmination of quite a lot that's happened this afternoon, especially because the teaching profession hasn't really engaged fully with that question of not how does my practice change, but how does my identity change. And I'd be really enthusiastic about taking this work and putting it into the CCPE environment with the other the other two universities and yourself, and exploring how this work could make things happen in that next round of inquiry.
Yeah. That would be really interesting. Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Kevin.
So did you say the HEI focus groups were before accreditation?
The HEI focus groups were before the accreditation was awarded, so it was during the process. So there are very different responses.
Really uncertain period of time.
Yes. But arguably, if we think about the wider context, that's kind of the time we're in at the moment, isn't it? Pre the curriculum, pre the full enactment of professional standards and management of staff around those professional standards. So, I guess it was particularly time located. Sorry, John.
Yeah, your methodology doesn't allow you to identify individuals, does it?
No, it doesn't.
I was wondering whether all of the people in HEI had the same, what for some might be an existential crisis, quite frankly. If your whole identity has been about doing practical professional work, and now that is seen as the responsibility of the school, and it could raise fundamental questions about what my role is now in this new world. Others may come from a very different sort of intellectual background and experience, and may see the opportunity to do the sorts of things that higher education is being asked to do, which think much more clearly about theory and research and evidence and practice across Wales and internationally. They might see that as liberation. But your methodology kind of washes out those differences, doesn't it?
It allows the different voices to be heard, but it doesn't allow us to explore relationships between, for example, previous experience, because we felt it was more important to have a methodology that guaranteed for those staff involved that we wouldn't know who was speaking. So there are limitations in that methodology for sure, and we have
might there be differences in perspective? Would there be a hunch? Would it be a hunch there were differences in perspective in your staff group, do you think?
I don't think there was very much evident at that time. Okay. I think when we rerun the focus groups this year, now that we're enacting those shared accountability, shared responsibility programs of ICE, I think we will hear some different perspectives, and I think that'll be quite interesting.